Her name was Helen, and she was the most beautiful woman who ever lived. So beautiful that when she was just 12 years old, the hero Theseus kidnapped her, sparking the first war fought over her beauty. So beautiful that every king and prince in Greece wanted to marry her, nearly causing a civil war before she even chose a husband. And so beautiful that when she fell in love with the wrong man, it would trigger the most famous war in human history, destroy the greatest city on earth, and kill hundreds of thousands of people over 10 brutal years. This is the true story behind the Trojan War, and it's far more shocking than anything Hollywood has shown you. The year was approximately 1194 BC, and Helen was already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. One of the most powerful rulers in Greece, she had given him a daughter, and seemed content with her life as queen. But everything changed when a ship arrived in Sparta carrying Prince Paris of Troy, the most handsome man in the ancient world. Paris wasn't just any prince. He was the son of King Priam, ruler of Troy, the richest and most powerful city in the known world. Troy controlled the entrance to the Black Sea, meaning every ship carrying grain, gold, or goods had to pay tribute to pass through their waters. This made Troy incredibly wealthy, but also incredibly hated by every other nation that depended on trade. Paris had come to Sparta on what appeared to be a diplomatic mission, but he had a secret agenda that would change the course of history. 3 years earlier, Paris had been chosen by the gods to judge a beauty contest between 3 goddesses: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised him power over all of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in war that would make him undefeatable in battle. But Aphrodite made him an offer he could not refuse: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and she promised him Helen of Sparta. When Paris arrived in Sparta, King Menelaus welcomed him with the legendary Greek hospitality. The Spartans threw feasts in his honor, gave him expensive gifts, and treated him like family. Menelaus had no idea he was hosting the man who would destroy his life. For days, Paris and Helen exchanged glances across the great hall during banquets. The attraction was immediate and overwhelming. Helen had never felt anything like this before. Her marriage to Menelaus had been arranged for political reasons when she was barely 16. She respected her husband but had never truly loved him. Paris represented everything her life was missing: passion, adventure, and romance. But Helen was not just any woman having an affair. She was the queen of Sparta, and her actions would have consequences far beyond her personal happiness. Ancient Greek society was built on concepts of honor and reputation. A man's worth was measured by his ability to protect his family and property. If another man stole his wife, it was seen as the ultimate insult, worse than stealing his gold or burning his crops. It was a direct challenge to his manhood and his right to rule. Meanwhile, Paris was playing a dangerous game. He knew exactly what he was doing and what it would cost. Troy had been growing increasingly isolated as other Greek cities formed alliances against them. Paris saw Helen as more than just a beautiful woman. She was his ticket to legitimacy, a way to humiliate the Greeks and show that Troy was stronger than all of them combined. The seduction took weeks. Paris used every trick in the book: poetry, expensive gifts from Troy, tales of adventure, and promises of a life filled with luxury and excitement. Helen was torn between duty and desire, between the safe life she knew and the passionate unknown Paris offered. She knew that leaving with him would mean abandoning her daughter, betraying her husband, and potentially starting a war. But she also knew this might be her only chance at real happiness. The night Helen made her choice changed everything. Some accounts say Paris kidnapped her by force. Others claim she went willingly, madly in love and ready to abandon everything for passion. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What we know for certain is that one night, while Menelaus was away attending a funeral, Helen and Paris disappeared from Sparta along with a fortune in gold and treasures from the royal treasury. They sailed for Troy under cover of darkness, and by morning, the scandal was spreading across Greece like wildfire. When Menelaus returned and discovered what had happened, his rage was beyond description. This wasn't just personal betrayal. It was a diplomatic catastrophe that threatened the balance of power in the ancient world. Helen wasn't just his wife. She was a symbol of Spartan strength and Greek honor. Her defection to Troy was seen as a victory for their enemies and a humiliation for every Greek king. But Menelaus couldn't simply declare war on Troy alone. Troy was too powerful, protected by massive walls that had never been breached and defended by the greatest warriors in the world, including the legendary Hector, Paris's older brother. Menelaus needed help, and he knew exactly where to get it. Years earlier, when Helen had been choosing her husband, her father had made all her suitors swear an oath. They promised that whoever married Helen, the others would protect him and help recover her if she was ever stolen. This oath bound the most powerful men in Greece to Menelaus's cause, including his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the most powerful ruler in Greece. The oath also bound Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, who would later become famous for his 10-year journey home. It bound Ajax the Great, a warrior so massive he could fight with a shield the size of a tower. Most importantly, it bound Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, faster than the wind and nearly invincible in battle. Within months, the greatest military force in ancient history was assembling. Over 100,000 warriors gathered at the port of Aulis, representing virtually every Greek city-state. They brought with them over 1,000 ships, the largest naval force ever assembled up to that point in history. This wasn't just about getting Helen back anymore. The Greek kings saw an opportunity to settle old scores with Troy and claim its legendary wealth for themselves. The Trojan War had officially begun, but it would be unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Ancient warfare was usually quick and brutal, lasting weeks or months at most. But Troy was different. The city was built on a hill overlooking the sea, surrounded by walls 30 feet high and 15 feet thick. These walls had been built by the gods themselves, according to legend, and no army had ever successfully besieged them. The city had multiple sources of fresh water, vast food supplies, and could be resupplied by ships from their allies across the Black Sea. When the Greek fleet finally reached Troy, they discovered they were in for a long fight. The initial assault on the city failed completely. The Trojans, led by Prince Hector, drove the Greeks back to their ships and nearly burned their entire fleet in a single day. It became clear that this would not be a quick victory. The Greeks were forced to build a fortified camp on the beach and settle in for what would become the longest siege in ancient history. Meanwhile, inside Troy, Helen was discovering that her new life wasn't quite what Paris had promised. While the Trojans didn't blame her directly for the war, she could feel their resentment. Every day, young Trojan men died fighting the Greeks, and everyone knew it was because of her affair with Paris. King Priam treated her with respect, but his wife Queen Hecuba made no secret of her hatred. Helen found herself increasingly isolated, trapped in a golden cage while a war raged outside the walls because of her choices. Paris, for his part, was proving to be far less heroic than he had seemed in Sparta. While his brother Hector fought bravely every day, Paris spent most of his time in the palace, avoiding battle whenever possible. As the war dragged on year after year, it became clear that this conflict was destroying both sides. The Greeks were dying of disease and exhaustion as much as from battle wounds. Their supplies were running low, and many of their best warriors had already fallen. The Trojans were trapped in their city, watching their allies abandon them one by one as the siege continued with no end in sight. The war produced some of the greatest heroes and most tragic stories in human history. Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, spent most of the war sulking in his tent because of a dispute with Agamemnon over a captured Trojan woman. When his best friend Patroclus was killed by Hector, Achilles went into a rage that became legendary. He returned to battle and killed Hector in single combat, then dragged his body around the walls of Troy for days in a display of brutality that shocked even his own allies. But Achilles' victory was short-lived. Paris, hiding behind the walls of Troy, shot Achilles in the heel with a poisoned arrow guided by the god Apollo. The greatest warrior in history died from a wound to the one part of his body that wasn't invulnerable, giving us the phrase Achilles' heel that we still use today. On the Trojan side, the losses were equally devastating. Prince Hector, the defender of Troy and the noblest warrior in the city, was dead. Many of their allies had been defeated or had switched sides. The city was running out of food, and morale was at an all-time low. King Priam had lost most of his sons, and Queen Hecuba had watched her family destroyed by a war that started because her son Paris couldn't control his lust for another man's wife. By the 10th year of the war, both sides were exhausted and desperate for a resolution. The Greeks had spent a decade away from home, and many of their kingdoms were falling apart in their absence. The Trojans were slowly starving inside their supposedly impregnable walls. Something had to give, and it finally did when Odysseus came up with the most famous trick in military history, the Trojan Horse. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. The Greeks built an enormous wooden horse as a supposed offering to the goddess Athena, then sailed away as if they were giving up the siege after 10 years of failure. Hidden inside the horse were 30 of their best warriors, including Odysseus himself. The Trojans found the horse on the beach and debated what to do with it. Some wanted to burn it or push it into the sea, but others argued it would bring bad luck to destroy a gift to the gods. The priest Laocoon famously warned, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," but he was killed by sea serpents before he could convince the others. Against their better judgment, the Trojans dragged the massive horse inside their city as a trophy of their victory over the Greeks. That night, while Troy celebrated what they thought was the end of the war, the Greek warriors emerged from the horse and opened the city gates. The main Greek army, which had been hiding nearby, poured into Troy and began the final assault. What followed was one of the most brutal sacks in ancient history. The Greeks showed no mercy after 10 years of war. They killed every man they could find, enslaved the women and children, and burned the great city to the ground. King Priam was murdered at the altar of Zeus by Achilles' son Neoptolemus. Queen Hecuba was taken as a slave and later transformed into a dog by the gods, according to myth. The famous walls of Troy, which had stood for centuries, were torn down stone by stone. Paris was killed during the final battle, struck down by an arrow from the Greek archer Philoctetes. His death was unremarkable, nothing like the heroic end he had probably imagined for himself when he first sailed to Sparta to steal Helen. The great love affair that had started the war ended with Paris dying in the mud while his city burned around him. But what happened to Helen, the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships and caused the death of hundreds of thousands of people? Different versions of the story give different endings to her tale, but they all agree on one thing. She survived while almost everyone else involved in her story died horrible deaths. According to most accounts, when Menelaus finally found Helen in the ruins of Troy, he planned to kill her for her betrayal. He had spent 10 years fighting to get her back, had lost thousands of his men, and had seen his world torn apart by war. But when he saw her again after all those years, her beauty was still so overwhelming that he couldn't bring himself to harm her. Instead, he took her back to Sparta, where they lived together for the rest of their lives. Some versions say they were happy together, that Helen had learned her lesson and become a devoted wife. Others suggest that their relationship was strained by the memories of what her affair had cost them both. Helen lived to old age, one of the few major characters from the Trojan War to die peacefully in her bed. But her legacy was written in blood and fire. The Trojan War marked the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of a dark period in Greek history. Many of the great cities that had sent warriors to Troy never recovered from their losses. Entire dynasties were wiped out, trade networks collapsed, and much of the eastern Mediterranean fell into chaos for generations. The war also had unexpected consequences for the survivors. Odysseus, the mastermind behind the Trojan Horse, spent 10 more years trying to get home to Ithaca, facing monsters and gods who were angry about the destruction of Troy. Many other Greek heroes died on their journeys home, or returned to find their kingdoms in ruins and their wives remarried to other men. The irony of Helen's story is that while she was called the face that launched 1,000 ships, she had very little control over her own destiny. She was treated as property by her first husband, as a prize by her lover, and as a symbol by both sides in the war. Her beauty was both her power and her curse, making her the most desired woman in the world, but also the most hated. The Trojan War shows us how personal choices can have massive historical consequences, but it also reveals the price of treating women as objects rather than people. Helen's affair with Paris destroyed 2 civilizations and changed the course of history, all because no one bothered to ask what she actually wanted, or to consider that she might be a human being with her own desires and agency, rather than just a beautiful face to be won or stolen.